Hey, what's up all you gamers out there? Welcome back for another Mythic Heroes video. I'm Galaxus. Thanks for tuning in, guys. What we're going to be doing today is taking a look at the hero tier list that Asura has put up for us over on Reddit. Guys, go ahead and check it out on Reddit. I'll leave a link here in the description. This is the updated list for November, including all of the new heroes. And Asura has taken the time to do this for us. So big ups to Asura for putting this out there. But we're going to go ahead and take a look at the list and we'll talk about where the heroes are coming in. Lucifer, as you can see in early game, he is ranked at a 9. Early game 1 through 15. Mid game he goes to 9. He gets a little bit stronger even in the late game at a 10. Against bosses, he's a 8.9, and against player versus player, he's a 10. Overall rating of 9.4. And his recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 400 and divinity 15. So that is what we have for Lucifer. Let's continue on and take a look. Now we have Nua. Nua coming in is another UR coming in at 9 early game. Mid game, she starts to pick up with a 9.5 and then begins to fall off a little bit in the late game. Against bosses, she's an 8.9, and player versus player, she's coming in at 9. Her overall rating is 9.1, and the recommended weapon and divinity for her is going to be 400 plus a D15 divinity. So that is what we have for Nua. Let's go ahead and take a look at Tamamo no Mai. She is an SSR coming in at 8.5 early game, 9 in the mid game, and 8 starts to fall off a little bit in the late game. Against bosses, she's coming in at 8.8, and against player versus player, coming in at a 9 with an overall rating of 8.7. She's third on the list, and that is definitely earned. And her recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 300 and D15, divinity 15. So there you go. And honestly, Tamamo is probably my most favorite hero in the game, but let's keep on moving on. We're not going to show any favoritism. Izanami, another dope hero that I have on my free-to-play, is the main carry. She's another SSR. She's coming in at 8.5, and again, like Tamamo, she's going to be a 9 mid and then drop down to an 8 late game. Against bosses, she's 8.5, PvP 9. She's coming in at 8.6, just slightly under Tamamo. Recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 300 and divinity 15. Pretty dope hero though. Now we have GM, which is Ganjang and Moi. SSR 8.5 is her early game. 9, well, them I guess is what you should say. They're 8.5 in the early game. They are 9 in the mid game, and again, like the other two, they drop down to 8 in the late game. And then against bosses, you got 8.4, and PvP still coming in at 9 with a solid 8.6 overall rating. Recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 400 and D15 there for GM. So you got to get that weapon up to 400 to really make it shine. All right, we're going to keep on moving on. We're going to the master healer of the game, Iden. A lot of people call her. I call her Eden personally. SSR, and she comes in at 8 early game, 9 mid game, starts to get better, and then kind of falls off a little bit, 8.5 in the late game. 8.3 against bosses, and PvP 9, coming in pretty solid. 8.6 overall rating, and recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 300, weapon and divinity 15 as well for Eden. Okay, coming on down to Susanoo. Susanoo, SSR hero, 7.5 early game, and just starts to shine with a 9 in the mid game, and then begins to fall off a little bit at 8 in the late game. Against bosses, he's coming in at a 9, and player versus player, hitting with a solid 9 as well, coming in with a nice 8.5 overall rating, and really shines with a 400 weapon and divinity 15. Got to keep on grinding there on your Susa. Okay, Isit is a UR, and she is coming in at 8 early game, at 8.5 in the mid game, and this kind of stays 8.5 late game. So she gets strong and kind of just stays strong. 8.9 against the bosses, 8.5 against player versus player. Brings her down to 8.5 overall, but still a really, really strong hero. And recommended weapon and divinity is going to be 400 and divinity 15. Okay, we're moving on to Flora, a newer hero, SSR hero. And she is coming in at 8 early game. And then she begins to shine at 8.5 in mid game. Stays solid late game with 8.5. And against bosses, she's coming at 8.4. Player versus player, 8.5. Overall rating, 8.4. And 300 is her weapon plus divinity 15 is what you need and recommended for her. Okay, now we're moving on to Artemis. Artemis comes in at 7.5 early game, 8 mid game, and really starts to shine late game at a 9. Against bosses, she's 9.2, pretty solid, really, really usable against bosses. 8.5 against player versus player, bringing her in at 8.4 overall, and she needs 400 weapon and D15 in order to shine. Artemis is a beast though. Okay, moving on to Athena. Athena, SSR hero, one of the best, or probably the best tank in the game. She's coming in with an 8 in early game, 8 mid game, and late game she shines with a 9. Against bosses, she's only coming at 7.3, and PvP she's coming in at 8. And overall rating is going to be 8.1. You need a weapon 300 on her and divinity 15. That's what you're going to need to throw on Athena. All right, so Persephone coming in at a 6 early game. So she doesn't really do very well early game. Mid game, she picks it up a little bit at 7.5. And then late game, she just absolutely shines, sitting there at a 9. Against bosses, she's coming at 8.5. And against player versus player, she's coming in actually at a 9. Really solid. That sits her at an even 8.0. And 300 is her weapon with a divinity of 15. That is what's recommended for Persephone. All right, now we have Zeus. Zeus is coming in at a 7 early game, 7.5 mid game, and he kind of takes off there, gets a little bit stronger with an 8 late game. Against bosses, he's an 8.5. That's kind of where he shines. Player versus player, he really has an edge. So he gets a 9 there, giving him a solid overall rating of 8.0. And all you need on him is a level 200 weapon and divinity 15. Okay, next hero we're going to look at is Nagakanya. Nagakanya is coming in at a 7 early game, coming in at an 8 mid game, and she starts to shine and take off late game. She is a 9. Against bosses, she's coming in at 7.9, and against player versus player, she's going to be an 8, giving her an overall 8 rating, and she needs a 400 weapon and divinity 15 to shine. All right, moving on to Medusa. Another SSR hero. She's coming in at 7 early game, 8 mid game, and 8 late game. Kind of just stays pretty even and solid. 8.1 against bosses and an 8 against player versus player. 7.8 is her overall rating, and 400 is her weapon suggestion and divinity 15. All right, now we're looking at the newer hero Thor, an SSR hero, tank hero coming into the game. He's coming in at a nice solid 8, and then mid game he's going to be 8 as well. He begins to kind of fall off a little bit late game, 7.5. Against bosses, he's a 7.5, and player versus player, he's getting rated at 8, giving him overall rating of 7.8. And For weapons, you go ahead and give him a 300 and Divinity 15, and that should do well with Thor. Okay, now we're moving on to Cleopatra. Cleopatra is an SSR hero. She's coming in at 6 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 8 late game. Against bosses, she's an 8.5, but she really shines in player versus player mode, where she's a 9. 7.8 overall rating, and 400 weapon plus a Divinity 15 is what's suggested for her. Okay, moving on to Lilith. A UR hero pretty far down on the ranks here. She is coming in at 6 early game, 8 mid game, and 8 late game. 7.8 against bosses and 8 against player versus player. And 7.6 is her overall rating. That is going to be a 400 weapon suggestion with the Divinity 15 for Lilith. All right, moving on to Hercules. SSR hero Hercules is coming in at 7 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 8 late game. He's only coming in at 7.1 against bosses and 7.5 with player versus player, bringing him a 7.4 overall rating, and it's suggested to have a 300 weapon with a Divinity of 15 for him. Okay, so next hero we're looking at is Hades. He's an SSR hero, a nice tank. He's coming in at 8 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 7 late game. So he starts to fall off a little bit. 6.5 against bosses and 8 against player versus player. 7.4 overall rating, and his weapon 300 with a Divinity of 15 is what's suggested for Hades. All right, moving on to Oberon. Oberon is an SSR hero. He's coming in at 7 early game, 7.5 mid game, and 8 late game. So he starts to kind of pick up. 7.8 against bosses, but only 6 against player versus player, and 7.3 overall rating. His suggested weapon and Divinity 400 with the Divinity 15. Okay, let's take a look at Anubis. Anubis is an SSR hero with a 6 rating for early game, 7 for mid game, and 8.5 for late game. 7.1 is going to be his boss rating, and player versus player, he's getting an 8, bringing him in at 7.3 overall. And for weapons, we're going to need a 300 with a Divinity of 15 for this guy. Okay, now let's take a look at Dionysus. Dionysus is coming in at 5 early game, 6 mid game, begins to shine a little bit late game at 8. 9.4 against bosses. He's an amazing hero for bosses. 9.4. 7.5 player versus player. 7.2 overall, and 300 weapon suggestion with a Divinity of D13. Okay, now we're on to Gaia. Gaia is another SSR tank. She's coming in at 6 early game, 6 mid game, and 9 late game. She really starts to shine late game. Pretty surprising, right? 6.9 is what she's coming in against bosses, and 8 against player versus player. 7.2 is her overall rating, and she suggested to have a weapon of 300 with Divinity 15. All right, now we got a couple more here left to do. Joan of Arc is an SSR hero coming in at 5 early game, 6 mid game, but 8.5 late game. So she really picks up in the late game. She's given an 8.2 against bosses and 8 against player versus player. With an overall rating of 7.1, suggested to have a weapon of 400 with a Divinity 15 for her. And our last hero on the list, Lubu. He is an SSR hero. He's coming in at 5 early game, 6 mid game, 7 late game, and a 7.7 against bosses, 7 player versus player, and he's getting a 6.5 overall rating. Suggested weapon is going to be 400 with a Divinity of 15. So that's going to wrap the list up, guys. Hopefully this is going to be helpful to some of you guys out there. If you want to see this tier list, go ahead and go directly to Reddit and you can check it out over there. Again, I'm going to be leaving the link over there to check it out so you can see it directly yourself. Another big shout out to Asura for putting in the work and putting this list together for us. Very much appreciated. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you leave a thumbs up, leave a like, come back, check out some more videos, and I will catch you guys next time. I'm out of here. Peace.